starting to get a much clearer picture as to what happened to Silicon Valley Bank, starting to get a much clearer picture of what regulators were doing or not doing, acknowledging in its latest report that it was too slow to respond to problems at the various banks here, and now asking for sweeping reforms in oversight of the banking sector. Our next guest knows a ton about the legislative and regulatory machinations down in Washington, particularly when it comes to finance. He now leads Better Markets, his nonprofit focus on financial empowerment, financial justice, and financial equality. Dennis Kelleher joining us right now. And Dennis, I do want to start off here with the big report coming first out of the Fed that focused on the SVB, not so much on to what went wrong, but effectively what they're calling for, which is oversight. Oversight that I think, Dennis, a lot of us thought already was there.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, most people thought that the Federal Reserve, which was responsible for regulating and supervising the big banks in the United States, and Silicon Valley Bank was the 16th largest bank in the United States when it failed, people thought the Fed was actually doing its job of regulating and supervising it. Unfortunately, it was not. Some of us, especially, Better Markets and others, have been complaining for years about the deregulation that the Fed engaged in during the Trump administration and how it was allowing risks to build up that were going to materialize and lead to problems like those that happened. But others took comfort in the fact that the Fed was supposed to be the regulator, and it failed in its job. And the report that was put out today by the Fed, the Vice Chair for Supervision, Michael Barr in particular, details the very deep and broad failures of the Federal Reserve in regulating and supervising that bank and other banks, frankly.
Yeah, and just to put a fine point at it, Michael Barr, of course, did actually single out his predecessor, Randy Quarles, basically saying that he led an effort, and I'm using his words, to, quote, tailor regulations for those mid-size or regional lenders. We should point out we did reach out to Randy Quarles for comment, and we are waiting to hear a response from him. On that point, Dennis, I am curious as to what the Fed, and for that matter, what regulators overall can do to sort of reverse that. Is there even a political climate to sort of walk any of that unraveling back, if you will?
Well, that's the key question. Frankly, the political climate is too often overly influenced by the political power of the financial industry and their campaign contributions and their lobbyists, which, after all, is what caused the deregulation in the first place, which caused Silicon Valley Bank and other banks to be underregulated and undersupervised. So I think a political response that's meaningful and effective here is probably quite unlikely. However, regulators have ample and significant authority here. The report talks about the need for rulemakings to address the lack of capital, liquidity, stress tests, living wills, and other just basic financial protections that should be in place and were taken out during the Trump administration. The report talks about doing multi-year rulemakings here. Well, by the time you get done with a multi-year rulemaking, you're going to have another crash, another crisis. What Better Markets is advocating is that the Fed and the other banking regulators actually issue interim final rules right now. When an agency finds that it has good cause to issue a final rule without first publishing a proposed rule, it can do that, and an interim final rule becomes effective immediately upon publication.
Yeah. I am curious, though. I mean, we talk about sort of who was in place already, the idea that there was an oversight apparatus there. Now, whether it was adequate or not, that remains, I think, still an open question. But I think it's interesting seeing these competing reports, including the Government Accountability Office putting out one and kind of criticizing the San Francisco Fed staff. And I thought deep in that Fed report, they kind of talk about this idea how they had actually had a supervisory finding back in November of last year that effectively showed that they had concerns about Silicon Valley Bank, but not necessarily to a level that would have required them to step in. It's not a lot of space between November 2022 and March of 2023. And I'm just wondering how they could not have been a little bit more proactive on that.
Well, there's no question they should have been more proactive as to Silicon Valley Bank. And let's not forget other banks similarly situated with some of the same characteristics. They should have been. They were not. There's plenty of blame to go around. And frankly, a large, most of it really lays at the doorstep of the prior administration, which ushered in deregulation and the lack of supervision. But none of that excuses the Fed and the other banking regulators at this point to take action. They have to stop acting swiftly when there's a crash, but acting slowly to prevent a crash. If they acted more swiftly to prevent the crash, they wouldn't then have to act quickly when there was a crash. When Silicon Valley Bank crashed, within days, if not hours, the Fed, the FDIC, and others all put together rescue packages that are going to cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 billion. Three banks have crashed. We've got another bank right now on the precipice of crashing. We have contagion. And what we need to do is take action. They need to do is take action now with the authority they have to increase capital, liquidity, living wills, and spread, just the basics of regulation that everybody thought they were already doing.
Yeah, well said, Dennis. Going to have to leave it there. Up against a commercial break. Better Market CEO and co-founder Dennis Kelleher there. Stick with us. We'll be back in a moment after the break from New York. This is Bloomberg.